There are films that entertain, and then there are films that burrow into your mind and refuse to leave. Crimson Tide, Tony Scott's 1995 submarine thriller, belongs firmly in the second category. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward military action picture. Two officers clashing aboard a nuclear submarine during a global crisis. But beneath that surface, much like the vessel the story center, lies a world of hidden decisions, suppressed histories, and fascinating secrets that most audiences never discover. The film starring Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington has aged remarkably well, and understanding what went on behind the scenes and beneath the narrative makes watching it an entirely different experience. These are 25 secrets about Crimson Tide that have remained hidden for decades, and knowing them will change how you see this film forever. The story begins with what might be the most fundamental question any thriller can ask, and Crimson Tide asks it without flinching. When the USS Alabama receives orders to launch nuclear missiles, and then receives a second transmission that gets severed before completion, two officers are left in an impossible position. Do you follow the last confirmed order and potentially trigger global annihilation? Or do you wait for clarification and risk being destroyed before ever getting a chance to act? This dilemma is not just a plot device dropped into the story to manufacture drama. It is a philosophical engine that drives every single scene, every confrontation, every moment of unbearable tension from the first act to the last. Captain Ramsey, played by Hackman with gruff, weathered authority, believes the answer is clear. You follow orders. That is what military discipline exists to demand. And without absolute obedience, the entire command structure collapses into dangerous uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Hunter, played by Washington with quiet, principled conviction, sees it differently. Launching weapons capable of ending millions of lives requires absolute certainty, and incomplete orders cannot constitute that certainty. The genius of the film is that neither man is entirely wrong. Ramsey is not a villain, and Hunter is not simply a hero. They are two intelligent, dedicated officers whose worldviews have collided at the worst possible moment, and the audience is left to sit with the discomfort of genuinely not knowing who is right. What makes this central conflict even more gripping is that it was not born purely from imagination. Cold War submarines operated under pressures that most civilians could barely conceive of. Crews spent months submerged, completely cut off from the outside world, carrying weapons capable of ending civilization, and living in spaces barely large enough to contain them. In that environment, tensions did occasionally boil over. The writers of Crimson Tide drew from declassified accounts and historical records of close calls, actual incidents where submarine personnel found themselves facing agonizing decisions without clear guidance from command. These were not dramatic inventions cooked up in a Hollywood writer's room. They were genuine moments in history when the fate of nations rested on individuals trapped underwater with incomplete information and no way to verify the orders they were receiving. By grounding the fictional conflict in these authentic Cold War anxieties, the film achieves a weight that pure invention could never manufacture. Viewers sense, even without knowing the historical details, that they are watching something that reflects real fears, real vulnerabilities in the systems designed to protect them. That authenticity seeps into every frame and transforms what could have been a simple action thriller into something that feels genuinely consequential. Before a single image appears on screen, the title itself is doing work that most audiences never consciously register. Crimson Tide was not chosen randomly or for marketing convenience. The phrase operates on multiple levels simultaneously, preparing viewers for the experience ahead before they have even settled into their seats. Most obviously, the title references the USS Alabama, whose nickname connects directly to University of Alabama's famous football team, the Crimson Tide. But the imagery reaches further than a geographical nod. The word crimson evokes blood, danger, violence barely contained beneath a calm surface. The word tide suggests inevitability, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with or redirected, something that simply comes regardless of human intention. Together, these words prepare audiences for a story where characters struggle against currents large in themselves, where individual crashes against institutional force, and neither emerges entirely intact. It is a masterclass in how thoughtful titling can establish tone and theme before the narrative begins, creating a layer of meaning that rewards audiences who pause to consider why a film chose its name. Authenticity in filmmaking often comes down to details that audiences feel rather than consciously notice. The production team understood this, and capturing genuine submarine footage became a priority that would shape the movie's entire visual identity. Their solution was to work with the real USS Alabama, an actual ballistic missile submarine whose presence in exterior shots lends undeniable credibility to the world being depicted. Filming around an operational naval vessel presented enormous challenges. Scheduling had to accommodate actual military operations that could not be postponed for Hollywood convenience. Lighting conditions were unpredictable in ways that controlled studio environments never are. Camera crews worked in environments that were never remotely designed for film production. But these difficulties ultimately benefited the final product in ways that could not have been anticipated. The Alabama's weathered surfaces, its massive industrial scale, its functional machinery that exists not for aesthetic purposes but for genuine operational necessity, none of that could have been replicated convincingly on a sound stage. What emerges on screen is a world that feels genuinely inhabited by history. And when characters discuss the vessel's capabilities and limitations, audiences believe them because they have seen the genuine article with their own eyes. The Navy's involvement with the real Alabama does not tell the complete story of the military's relationship with this production, however, because that relationship was far more complicated and contentious than most audiences realize. When the U.S. Navy reviewed the screenplay, they declined involvement. The portrayal of mutiny aboard a nuclear submarine crossed a line they were not prepared to endorse under any circumstances. Their concern centered specifically on how the story depicted command breakdown on one of America's most sensitive military assets, showing officers defying orders, questioning the chain of command, essentially depicting the nuclear launch system as vulnerable to internal disagreement, conflicted fundamentally with the image of absolute discipline and ironclad reliability that the military needed to project to the American public and to the world. This rejection meant the filmmakers lost access to resources that would have simplified production considerably: technical advisors, equipment, locations, and a kind of institutional cooperation that can smooth every aspect of a complicated shoot. Rather than derailing the project, this refusal became a strange gift. Working around military objections forced creative problem-solving that may have ultimately sharpened the film's edge considerably. Without official cooperation softening the narrative, the story retained its provocative premise intact, asking uncomfortable questions about nuclear command authority that an officially sanctioned production might have been pressured to soften or abandon entirely. Before Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington were ever attached to the project, the casting process explored dramatically different possibilities that would have produced an entirely different film. Names like Al Pacino and Warren Beatty circulated for the role of Captain Ramsey, while Brad Pitt was reportedly considered for the role of Hunter. Simply imagining these alternate versions reveals how profoundly casting shapes a film's identity. Pacino's volcanic, unpredictable intensity differs fundamentally from Hackman's gruff, weathered authority. Beatty would bring an entirely different quality to the command dynamic, something more glamorous and perhaps less lived in. Pitt, still building his leading man credentials in the mid-90s, might have pushed Hunter's characterization toward youthful rebellion rather than the principled, intellectually grounded conviction that Washington brought to the role. What ultimately emerged was a pairing that balanced with almost mathematical precision. Hackman brought decades of experience playing complex authority figures whose righteousness is always slightly shadowed by something more ambiguous. Washington delivered moral certainty that never tips into self-righteousness. Their chemistry created a conflict where neither man registers as a villain, where both seem genuinely justified in their positions, and where audiences find themselves shifting allegiances from scene to scene. That balance might not have existed with different leads, making the final casting one of those fortunate alignments that elevates material beyond what any version of the screenplay could have accomplished alone. The screenplay itself underwent significant transformation before cameras ever rolled. Early drafts leaned heavily into procedural military drama, prioritizing technical accuracy and detailed depictions of chain-of-command protocols. While authentic in its way, this approach risked creating something more educational than gripping, a documentary with actors rather than a thriller that keeps audiences leaning forward in their seats. The transformation came through successive rewrites that progressively shifted emphasis from procedure to personality. Rather than depicting how submarines operate in clinical detail, The story became fundamentally about two men with incompatible worldviews trapped together during a crisis with no exit. Technical elements remained, and they remain important, but they were repositioned to serve character development rather than dominate it. Military consultants provided feedback that helped refine both accuracy and dramatic effectiveness, a rare combination where authenticity and entertainment genuinely reinforced each other. The evolution from procedural to personal reveals something essential about storytelling that the filmmakers understood intuitively. Audiences connect with people, not processes. By recentering the narrative around the philosophical clash between Ramsey and Hunter, the script found its emotional core, and everything else fell into place around that center. One of the most surprising secrets in the film's history involves a contributor whose name never appeared in the credits, but whose distinctive voice can be heard in some of the movie's most memorable exchanges. Quentin Tarantino, whose own career was exploding in the mid-90s following the success of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, was brought in to contribute uncredited dialogue polish to key scenes. His involvement remained largely unknown until industry insiders began discussing it in interviews years after the film's release. Tarantino's fingerprints appear in moments that feel slightly distinct from the surrounding material: banter about Silver Surfer comics, references to classic submarine films like Run Silent, Run Deep, the kind of pop culture woven into tense situations that became his signature style across his own work. These exchanges serve a crucial purpose beyond entertainment value. They provide breathing room between high-stakes confrontations while simultaneously revealing character through seemingly casual conversation. The contribution works because it never overwhelms the film's tone. These additions feel organic rather than intrusive, human rather than showy. The crew debates comic book trivia one moment and faces nuclear annihilation next, and that contrast creates a human dimension that pure military procedural would entirely lack. Hans Zimmer's score for Crimson Tide broke from conventional thriller scoring in ways that proved genuinely influential on everything that followed. Rather than reaching for traditional orchestral bombast, the kind of swelling strings and percussive drama that action thrillers typically deployed in the 90s, Zimmer crafted something more insidious and more effective. Synthesizers, ambient textures, and hypnotic repetitive motifs create an atmosphere that feels oppressive and relentless, perfectly mirroring the submarine's claustrophobic environment. Rather than instructing audiences when to feel afraid through obvious musical cues, the score creates constant unease that never fully resolves. Low drones and pulsing rhythms suggest danger lurking just beyond perception, forces building towards something terrible that keeps getting deferred. This restraint makes the moments of full orchestral power hit considerably harder when they finally arrive. Zimmer's work became one of the film's most recognizable and celebrated elements, and its influence spread rapidly through the genre in the years following the film's release. The technique of using minimalist electronic elements to build sustained dread now appears throughout military thrillers and beyond. What seemed experimental in 1995 established templates that composers still follow today. The tension that the film manufactures through its emergency action message sequences represents some of the most sophisticated thriller mechanics in the genre. These communications, orders transmitted to submarines regarding nuclear launch authorization, arrive at precisely calibrated moments throughout the narrative, designed with surgical precision to maximize dramatic pressure and force impossible decisions at the worst possible times. Messages arrive incomplete, get interrupted by attacks, or conflict with previous orders in ways that strip characters of the comfortable certainty they desperately need. Every interrupted transmission was carefully placed to escalate tension exactly when the story required acceleration, creating a cumulative rhythm that audiences internalize without realizing it. Early timing pressure establishes the stakes. Middle-act countdowns raise them methodically, and the climactic sequence compresses time until decisions must happen in seconds. Viewers experience physical stress as deadlines approach, feeling the same urgency that is crushing the characters on screen. This technique transforms abstract nuclear threat into visceral, moment-to-moment anxiety that never allows the audience to settle into comfortable spectatorship. The philosophical conversation at the heart of Crimson Tide operates on a level that rare action films ever attempt. Captain Ramsey embodies institutional loyalty taken to its logical extreme. Orders exist to be followed because the system depends on absolute obedience, and without that commitment, the entire command structure dissolves into dangerous, potentially fatal uncertainty. His position is not villainous. It reflects a genuine philosophy that military discipline requires, and that has sound reasoning behind it. Hunter represents a competing value that is equally genuine and equally defensible. Individual moral judgment cannot be entirely surrendered to institutional authority, especially when millions of lives hang in the balance. Following orders toward nuclear launch when those orders may be outdated or wrong violates something deeper than protocol, something that cannot be dismissed simply because following orders is more institutionally convenient. The film refuses to declare either man definitively correct. It presents their clash as a genuine moral dilemma that thoughtful viewers can debate for years, and this refusal to provide easy answers is precisely what has kept the film alive in cultural conversation long after most of its contemporaries have faded. The film's grounding in historical reality extends beyond its screenplay origins into actual documented incidents that haunted Cold War military planners for decades. Genuine near misses occurred throughout the nuclear age where miscommunication or technical failure nearly triggered catastrophic responses that would have been irreversible. Soviet early warning systems mistakenly detected incoming American missiles on at least one documented occasion, creating moments where individual officers had to decide against protocol and against the institutional pressure to act, to wait rather than retaliate. These events remain classified for years, but their existence informed serious discussions about command and control vulnerabilities that the systems in place were not always adequate to prevent. By channeling this authentic historical dread into its fictional scenario, Crimson Tide achieves a weight that pure invention cannot match. Audiences sense they're watching something that, while dramatized, reflects genuine risks that existed throughout the nuclear age and that have never entirely disappeared. Reports from production suggest that the intensity depicted on screen was not entirely manufactured. Working in confined sets designed to replicate submarine interiors created genuine psychological pressure that affected everyone involved in ways that were difficult to fully anticipate. Actors spent long hours in cramped, dimly lit spaces that blurred the boundary between performance and actual physical discomfort. Creative disagreements reportedly flared between cast members and production leadership during the more demanding sequences. Whether these tensions were significant or simply the ordinary stress of an ambitious shoot in difficult conditions, something clearly channeled into performances. Hackman and Washington's confrontations carry an electricity that feels genuinely volatile rather than carefully choreographed. The supporting cast radiates authentic exhaustion and anxiety that no amount of technical direction could entirely manufacture. The confined environment may have inadvertently replicated some of the psychological pressure it was depicting, creating performances that feel lived rather than simply acted. The supporting cast of Crimson Tide contains a remarkable collection of actors who were, at the time of filming, relatively early in careers that would eventually make them household names. Viggo Mortensen appears as Lieutenant Peter inch years before The Lord of the Rings transformed him into an international star. James Gandolfini plays Lieutenant Bobby Doherty nearly a decade before The Sopranos made him one of the most celebrated actors in television history. Neither role demands scene-stealing moments, and neither actor reaches for them. They bring the same professionalism to these supporting parts that they would later bring to roles that define their legacies. Ryan Phillip, Steve Zahn, and Rocky Carroll fill additional roles that could easily have been forgettable, but instead contribute to a cohesive, believable unit. The ensemble approach means there are no weak links to break the film's immersive spell. Audiences believe these men have served together, trust each other, and share a history that predates the crisis they are experiencing, and that belief comes entirely from the quality of performances filling every corner of the frame. The sequences depicting the submarine approaching its crushed depth represent some of the film's most technically interesting thriller mechanics. Real submarines operate with precise knowledge of their depth limits, and exceeding those boundaries does not mean gradual leaking or manageable structural damage. It means catastrophic implosion, happening faster than human perception can register. The film captures this reality not through graphic destruction, but through sound design and performance. Creaking metal, stress rivets, and panic glances that communicate the presence of forces completely beyond human control. What makes these sequences particularly effective is their claustrophobic inevitability. Characters cannot fight water pressure or negotiate with physics. Their options narrow to sending or dying, and circumstances sometimes prevent even the obvious choice. This helplessness amplifies tension beyond typical action scenarios where heroes can shoot or strategize their way free. Against crushed depth, courage is meaningless. Only engineering margins and luck determine who survives. The sound design throughout the film deserves recognition as an independent storytelling channel operating constantly beneath conscious awareness. Sonar pings have become almost synonymous with submarine cinema, but their deployment in Crimson Tide shows particular sophistication. The sounds are not merely present for atmosphere. They are weaponized for emotional effect. Distant contacts register as gentle pulses, while approaching threats grow sharper, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. Hull stress manifests through groaning metal that suggests the ocean actively pressing against every surface. Even silence is made threatening, implying dangers that sonar has not yet detected and that may already be too close to avoid. During crisis moments, alarms compete with shouted orders. Sonar readings compete with mechanical failure alerts, and audiences experience a sensory overload that matches what the characters are enduring. This calculated chaos makes calm moments feel precious and temporary, and when relative quiet returns, viewers remain alert, knowing the soundscape could erupt again without warning. The film's critical reception in 1995 was strongly positive, with reviewers consistently praising performances and the technical craftsmanship that Scott brought to the submarine environment. Hackman and Washington received particular attention for the chemistry that elevated material which could easily have felt formulaic in other hands. Some military experts and enthusiasts noted departures from actual protocol and technology, objections that never gained mainstream traction because general audiences were far more invested in the tension than in technical precision. Commercially, the film performed well, earning strong box office returns and extending its reach considerably through home video markets in the years that followed. Contemporary reassessment has been generous, with the film appearing regularly on lists celebrating the best thrillers of the 90s. Younger audiences discovering it on streaming platforms find the central conflict as compelling as audiences did in theaters 30 years ago, validating both the material and the choices made in bringing it to screen. The filmmakers demonstrated clear awareness of the submarine cinema tradition they were working within, and deliberate echoes of classic undersea thrillers appear throughout Crimson Tide for audiences who know where to look. The Hunt for Red October, which had revitalized submarine narratives just 5 years earlier, looms largest among recent influences. Both films share confined settings, Cold War tensions, and commanders whose decisions carry global consequences. But where that film emphasized external cat-and-mouse pursuit across vast ocean distances, Crimson Tide turns the drama entirely inward. The enemy is not somewhere out in the water. The enemy is within the same hull, and that inversion transforms the thriller mechanics completely. Older influences from Run Silent, Run Deep and Das Boot also echo through certain sequences. Their approach to building tension through waiting and pressure rather than explosive action visible in how Scott paces the film's most excruciating scenes. These homages serve purposes beyond simple genre appreciation. By invoking familiar submarine cinema territory, the film establishes expectations it can then fulfill, subvert, or deepen in ways that reward knowledgeable viewers without excluding newcomers. Home video releases of Crimson Tide eventually restored several scenes that had been cut during the editing process for theatrical pacing, revealing material that deepens character understanding and expands the narrative beyond what cinema audiences experienced. Extended conversations flesh out relationships among crew members and provide context for both Ramsey's command philosophy and Hunter's background that the theatrical cut never had time to explore. Fan response to these restored sequences has consistently been appreciative, with online discussions frequently recommending the longer version for repeat viewings. The deleted scenes also offer a fascinating window into creative decision-making, revealing what the filmmakers consider important enough to shoot but ultimately deemed expendable in service of momentum. This glimpse into how finished films emerge from much larger pools of captured material fascinates viewers curious about the invisible architecture that shapes every story they see on screen. The enduring cultural presence of Crimson Tide extends well beyond its original theatrical run. References to the film appear in television shows, subsequent military dramas, and online discussions where its central conflict has become shorthand for debates about authority versus conscience. Certain lines have entered cultural vocabulary, quoted by people who may never have seen the complete film. The Ramsey and Hunter dynamic has become a template for depicting institutional conflict in subsequent productions. The framework of rigid command structure against individual moral judgment absorbed so thoroughly into the culture that its origins have become invisible. Newer audiences continue discovering the film through streaming platforms, and unlike many 90s thrillers that feel trapped in their decade, the core conflict of Crimson Tide transcends its Cold War context entirely. Questions about when to follow orders and when to resist them are not historical questions. They are perpetual human questions, and each generation finds something meaningful and urgent in a film that refuses to answer them simply. Conversations about continuing the story have periodically surfaced over the decades since the original release. Producers and studio executives have reportedly discussed revisiting these characters or exploring similar scenarios updated for contemporary geopolitical contexts. Nothing has materialized into actual production, but the persistent interest itself tells a story. Studios do not seriously consider sequels to films that audiences have forgotten or grown indifferent toward. Modern nuclear anxieties have not disappeared. They have evolved and in some ways intensified in ways that will provide obvious frameworks for a continuation. The foundational conflict between duty and conscience, between institutional authority and individual moral judgment, requires no Cold War setting to remain compelling. Whether a sequel ever reaches screens ultimately matters less than what the ongoing discussion reveals about the original film's grip on cultural imagination, a grip that has not loosened in 3 decades and shows no sign of releasing anytime soon.